People whose works were scraped out from the history books. There are lots of brilliant people who did a lot of significant works and no doubt deserve credit in history, but for one reason to another, their works were scraped from the history books and were forgotten in obscurity. Here are some of them. Number 1. Designer of the first functioning plane. 𝗙𝗢𝗕𝗘𝗏 gave the Wright brothers designs, support, and financial backing. He was a railway engineer and aviation pioneer. He provided many emerging enthusiasts, including the Wright brothers, with help and advice, and helped to publicize their flying experiments. While the Wright brothers are generally viewed as the inventor of the first successful plane, 𝗙𝗏𝗘 has designed the first airplane, predating the Wright brothers by 4 years. His personal investigations into the problems of flight measurably advanced knowledge about powered flight in 1890s, and he shared that knowledge with the Wright brothers as they undertook the research that led to their successful 1903 test flights. Number 2. Edith Wilson was the second wife of Woodrow Wilson. She is sometimes called the secret president or first woman to run the government because she took over her husband Woodrow Wilson's duties after he suffered from stroke. She pre-screened all matters of state, running the executive branch of the government for the remainder of Wilson's second term. It was Mrs. Wilson who determined what bills would be brought to her husband's attention and who would be given orders. Only years later did the American public learn that there had been a vacuum in the White House chain of command. Number 3. The first woman in space. We are all aware of Sally Ride, generally viewed as the first woman in space. However, rarely heard and seen in the media is the Russian cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova, to whom the distinction aptly belongs. In 1963, when Ride was only 12 years old, Tereshkova was already taking laps around the Earth aboard the Vostok 6, and by the time Sally Ride finally hung up her spacesuit, Tereshkova had racked up more time in space than all United States astronauts combined. Number 4. The first guy to reach the North Pole. Robert Peary made a front page of every newspaper in America for being the first man to ever reach the North Pole. Because it was too cold, nobody had ever planted a flag there yet, until in 1909. History attributes this greatness to Robert Peary to be the first man to reach North Pole, a significant feat symbolic to man's earnest effort to dominate the natural world. However, some claims were that as they approached the farthest north point to the Arctic expedition, Robert grew more and more exhausted, suffering from exhaustion and frozen toes, unable to leave the camp. So, upon Peary's order, an African-American explorer, Matthew Henson, who was Robert Peary's assistant, led the 6-man team to reach the North Pole, and it was he himself who made it to the top of the world first. This picture of a historic moment reveals some interesting details. Who really was the first man in the North Pole? Was it Robert's way of honoring his crew by allowing them to pose for the historic moment, or was he really still back at the camp and able to make it to the last few miles, leaving his first man, Henson, to plant the flag and take a self-portrait with the team members? Be the judge. Number 5. Henry Poincare. The moment you hear the name Albert Einstein, you'll definitely be reminded of his genius and the work that made him famous, the theory of relativity. This theory changed the way physicists think about the universe and eventually won him a Nobel Prize. But behind the story of this glorious achievement, we barely notice the work of Henry Poincare. He was the foremost expert on relativity in the late 19th century and was most likely the person to formally present the theory of relativity. But despite having read his work, Albert Einstein never cited Poincare's work at all. Number 6. Who took down the crime boss Al Capone? We all know Al Capone, the American gangster nicknamed Scarface, who reigned as the crime boss for 7 years. And we also know Eliot Ness, the American prohibition agent, famous for chasing down Capone's criminal activity and his effort to bring down Al Capone. But behind the picture, we don't see Frank J. Wilson and George E.Q. Johnson, who spent 3 years trying to prove Al Capone was a millionaire who didn't pay his taxes. They had no proper trails to work on, no bank accounts, no endorsed check, no mortgage payments, or paycheck stubs. But when Al Capone was indicted for trial, none of the charges initiated by Ness stood. It was really the tax evasion case that Wilson and Johnson initiated that took Al Capone down. Number 7. Who invented the telescope? What we were told in schools is that Galileo invented the telescope, one of the most important investigative tools in astronomy today. But did you know that Lavoisier, a Dutchman, applied for a patent in 1608? The Dutch government refused his patent and instead issued a report sharing his work. Galileo read the said report, recreated Lavoisier's telescope with a stronger magnification, and the following year, Galileo was credited for inventing the telescope. Number 8. Paul Revere. We give high regards to Paul Revere, a patriot in American Revolution and best known for his midnight ride to alert the colonial militia about British invasion. Such patriotic act deserved much respect. But barely we have recognized the fact that he is not alone. There were actually 40 riders warning the people of the approaching British forces, and Paul Revere was one of them. When the British soldier intercepted him, Revere was arrested, but his image as the lone rider of the revolution comes from the poet Longfellow, who created a fictional account of one man's heroism to inspire the Americans who are experiencing civil war. So, that's the rundown of people who were scraped out from history books with their works buried in obscurity. If you love to watch a video that could literally shock your senses, try the next video. You will be shocked. Subscribe.